gospel we preach must apply to every area of life that has been fouled by sin and its effects. The church and individual Christian evangelists must preach the biblical gospel of comprehensive redemption, not just personal soul winning. Wherever sin reigns, there the gospel must be at work, transforming and restoring.
Hi, and welcome to the Devoted Word. I'm Joel McDermott, and we're brought to you by the American Vision. Please check us out at americanvision.org. Like, share, subscribe, and consider becoming a monthly supporter. Today we pick up in Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. After leaving off of the 6 days of creation, we are now going to look at the brief pronouncement of the first Sabbath day. And this is the Sabbath of God, not necessarily the Sabbath of man, and we'll describe some of that as we go. Chapter 2 of Genesis, verse 1 through 3. Thus the heaven and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day, and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. So, we know that God had just finished his works of creation. On the day before this, on the sixth day, God had created man. And what happened with the creation of man? Well, we're not exactly certain of that time frame, and we'll discuss a little more as we get into the next few verses dealing with the creation of Eden and Adam. But we know for certain that Adam was there for at least half a day or so, or part of a day after he was created. And then the very first full day of mankind is the first full day of God's rest. So that God's seventh day overlaps with man's first full day. And that becomes theologically significant, I think. And here's a passage from Dr. North's commentary on this passage, and ties some of these things together. The first full day of life for mankind was a day of rest, a Sabbath, he says. The seventh day was God's day of rest, or cessation from his creation work. Man had seen part of the sixth day. Adam had worked briefly as a kind of apprentice under God's immediate supervision. God had brought the animals to Adam. You'll see this in the next verses where Adam names the animals, and we've talked about that before. But the seventh day for God's creation week was the first full day for mankind. It was a day of rest. Man's week was therefore fundamentally different from God's week. God's week was wholly the product of God's creative acts. It ended with God's resting from his acts of creation. Man's week, on the other hand, began with rest. Man was wholly dependent on God. Man was not originally creative. Man could not legitimately claim to be the source of his own environment, the source of meaning, the source of power, or the source of any aspect of creation. Man began where God left off. Man was not originally creative. He was subordinate and recreative. And I would stress in this picture here, man was entirely dependent. In other words, man could not live by the works of man, for his first full day was a day of rest. He had been given dominion already, but his first full day was a day of rest, and so he couldn't be productive. He had to depend entirely upon God. And that is theologically significant. Yes, if we want to go down the road of a debate where we're debating the historicity of all this, 6 days versus a framework or all that, and I'm a 6-day guy, and I believe in the historicity of Adam, and I believe that Adam had to eat and do all the things that a human being had to do in order to survive through that first day. He had to have had food provided for him. Even in that sense, on this first day, he was entirely dependent upon God, because everything had been created in full bloom right there, a garden for Adam to eat of all the fruits of the tree, all of that stuff. And so in everything, he was entirely dependent, even in his physical being. But this is certainly theologically significant as well, that in his first day of existence, the first day of man's week, he was to rest from his own works. So that while throughout the Old Testament law, the ceremonial aspect of it is that you rest on the Sabbath day. You work until now, and you rest on the Sabbath day. That theologically, that was always reversed, and I'm not sure that's emphasized enough, even in the Old Testament. At least, certainly not the way we understand it, and it certainly did not become the way the old Jewish people understood it and lived accordingly. And we're going to see that in just a second. But so a couple notes here. The 8th day was man's first full day of work. This appears in the law also, in certain ways. In Leviticus 12, when the firstborn son was born, or when a son was born, he had to be brought to God and circumcised. Certainly not sacrificed. Circumcised on what day? The 8th day. Why the 8th day? Why does God say 8th day? Because, obviously, this is the first full day of man's work. And so this man is brought there. And, of course, man's work here in the ceremonial law is pointing to Christ. So Christ is the one fulfilling the law on our behalf. And he is the one shedding his blood. Also, this was the first day the firstborn male animal was sacrificed by the law. Under Exodus 22 and verse 30, I believe that's Exodus 22. So that anytime you had your livestock reproduce, the firstborn male from that animal had to be sacrificed unto the Lord. And that sacrifice was performed on the 8th day. So that the Sabbath law of the Old Testament was from man's perspective. It took place on the 8th day, which is the first day of full work for mankind. Again, you can see this in the patterns of the law, in that Jesus himself rose from the dead on the 8th day. And I'm not going to walk through all of that in dividing which days were what in the New Testament and the narrative and all that, but he rose from the dead on the 8th day. Compare this to the law. Leviticus 23 gives us the law for the first fruits offering, verses 10 through 12. On the day following the Sabbath at the end, again, this is from Dr. North's commentary, but you can find it in many other places. At the day following the Sabbath, at the end of the Passover week, the Israelites offered a first fruits offering. On that day, when the sheaf offering was waved, in other words, they had to take a sheaf of grain from the first cuts of the harvest and wave it before the Lord in a symbolic gesture, as in give that in an offering to God. When the sheaf offering was waved, also a lamb was sacrificed on that day. What is the day following the Sabbath day? It's the 8th day of the week, or the first day of the week, if you will. So that was symbolic, obviously, of the offering of Christ up on the altar of God. And the lamb that is slain, offered up before the Lord as part of the first fruits offering. Well, what does Paul call Jesus? In 1 Corinthians 15:23, Paul refers to Christ as the first fruits from the dead. All right, these aren't just, it wasn't just an old-fashioned word for first. It was a word tied directly to the technicality, the technical details of the Old Testament ceremonial law. And that was part of the Sabbath system of the Old Testament. This is done on the 8th day. So all of these things are tied there in the law, and this overlap between God's 7th day, man's first day, and then the 8th day being man's first day of work, all tie together and immediately drive us to Christ in the creation week, in the law, in the New Testament. And we'll see some more of that as we go on. So what I want you to get here, and let me just check some of my later notes here, is a pattern that is revealed in God's Sabbath system, so that there's a Sabbath from God's perspective, that it is His works and our rest, and then there is the Sabbath from our perspective, which is we begin with rest and then are inspired by His works, which His work allows us to be entered into rest to begin with. We go from gaining life and having rest in God to dominion. So that for God, it's work and then rest, and we start with that rest and move into work, so that we have this kind of relationship with God. That was true for Adam in his creation. It was true for Christ in his life, in his fulfillment of the law. It is true for us as well as the body of Christ. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this, and probably the next session as well, just briefly covering these topics. How is the Sabbath discussed? When it is given in the law, and this is probably where we're most familiar with it. We know it happened in Genesis. We don't talk about it as much there. We don't talk about the symbology of it, but we certainly hear it when we talk about the Ten Commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, and later verses 19 and 20. God gives them a commandment to keep the Sabbath day holy, because God worked for 6 days and rested in the seventh. So shall you people, and you shall not do any servile work, nor shall anybody under your guardianship or your authority, your wife, your servants, your children. Nobody in your household is allowed to work, and you are not allowed to let them work. And certainly, of course, not allowed to force them to work, so that there is that sense of mercy in it as well. But it is the fundamental commandment that you keep it holy. And in that word shows up both in the law and in the creation account, which we can kind of pass over if we're not really paying attention. That when we hear the law, we hear holiness over and over again. Be ye holy as I am holy. Keep this day holy. Keep my Sabbaths holy. And over and over and over again. But this was originally right there in the 7-day rest in creation week as well. We just read it, that God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, or in the Hebrew, that's the exact same word for made it holy. God made it holy. And so He calls to us to keep the day of rest holy. And so we do. What is holiness, by the way? Holiness is simply separation. It is simply setting apart from the normal routine and saying, we shall do something different this day. And specifically, the different thing we're doing is we're not working. We are resting. We are ceasing from labor. And that is symbolic. And I believe in God's creation week, it was symbolic. Everything in the creation week is symbolic. It's not only symbolic, as we've said before, but it's symbolic. It is ceremonial. God didn't have to create in 6 days. God could have created everything in one snap and made it appear, and then just began our work right after that day. Didn't even have to have a day of rest. Certainly didn't need 6 days to create it all. Didn't need a day of rest. But yet that's how He did it for our sake, for various reasons. The most of which is to show us the pattern of work and rest, and that defines our relationship with Him, so that we enter into the day He set aside as holy, in which we cease from our works. He ceases from His works, not because He has to, not because the same reason we think about that. You can't be saved by your own works. We know that. And so we have this kind of ceremonial day in which we set aside, or which is set aside for us, in which we cease from our works, symbolically recognizing our dependence upon God for our salvation, our provision, and everything else. But God didn't have to do that. He did it to set an example for us, to show us the way of holiness, to show us our need for him so that we can learn. So he creates the whole thing for, among other reasons, of course, for pedagogical purposes, to teach us. And that is one of the three great uses of the law. The pedagogical use is to teach us and drive us to Christ for our salvation. You need to cease from your works from the very beginning. From the day you open your eyes and realize there's a God here, you walk right into rest. And in fact, you better be there already, in a way. And God calls us to remember this day. You shall remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And that becomes the law for us. That is where we start. And we'll come to some of that in New Testament teaching as well. Let me cover this real quick, and we're going to jump back and forth between some different aspects here. But let me cover this really quickly. What we begin to see here is this pattern that God works and then he rests, and we enter into rest so that we are sanctified and holy, and we are made holy by his work. We are sanctified by his work, and our sanctification becomes the works that we do afterwards, so that our good works flow out of the rest that we have in him. I keep repeating that, but it needs to be repeated. So that there is this tie directly between rest and work. And in fact, the pattern I said earlier is life, rest, and dominion. God gives us life, and that life is recognized immediately in our rest in him, and then we move into dominion. So that there is a link between rest and dominion. There is a link between our rest totally in him, which is his work of salvation in us, and his work of salvation in good works, his work of good works through us, which is his law, are tied together. And that's why what is a creation ordinance, if you will, is also such a intensely such a part of the ceremonial law, not just on Seventh-day Sabbath, but on all the other Sabbaths that he had, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of First Fruits we just talked about, all of the feast days, the Jubilee laws, all the other things that had to do with the land and the people and the priesthood and all that kind of stuff. All of that becomes a greatly intensified system of Sabbaths in which God is bombarding his people, constantly saying, you must observe these Sabbaths because it's not about your work, it's about the work I'm doing in you. It's the work I'm doing in providing for you in creation. It's the work I'm doing in providing for you through the substitute sacrifices you're making over and over. I mean, think about this, and us as dense people, we know it's easy to criticize the Israelites in the Old Testament for not getting this, but we're just as bad. That we go through the motions of religion. Here, I'm bringing my animal. Pfft, the blood flows. I sprinkle the blood where it needs to be sprinkled. I put it on whatever it needs to be put on. I go through the motions, and I'm right with God. And God, like the whole time, you're getting backwards the message he's trying to tell you over and over and over again. Because we feel like as long as we come do this and put the animal here, that's our work. And our work is done, and now we can go rest. And it's completely backwards from what God is trying to tell you from day one. And that is, I give you life. I give you rest because of that sacrifice, which, by the way, is my son. It's not the work you're doing handing over the animal. It's not the work you're doing cutting its throat or however you kill it. It's not the work you're doing. That's not your work. That's my work. It's all my work. And you don't get forgiven and atoned for and saved unless that is my work, and unless you view that it is all my work up front, and you begin with rest in me and dependence in me. And then through that experience, you are made holy, and you are able to go out and do good works in my power. So God is telling them this over and over, that there is a link between rest in me and my law, and the rest comes first. And God's telling this over and over. And what do? They do precisely what we do also, and that is we defy those things because we have the whole system reversed, and we have our own thoughts in place, our own laws, our own standards, and we follow them over and over and over again. And it's in that vein of getting things backwards, of thinking I have dominion and doing work and then resting in God, that we foul the whole thing up 1,000 ways. What's the old saying? 1,000 ways till Sunday or something like that. Well, it includes Sunday too, maybe especially Sunday. But listen to this passage from Ezekiel 20, verses 12 through 21, and we'll end this session on this passage. And he says, the prophet tells the people, moreover, well, this is God speaking through the prophet, moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. What did I just say? The Sabbath is where you begin with rest. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They didn't walk in my statutes, but rejected my rules. See the link between resting in the Lord and following God's law? We mix it up. And when we do, we introduce human autonomy. And what's going to follow from that? You know it's going to follow from that. Idolatry is going to follow from that, of some sort. They did not walk in my statutes, but rejected my rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live. And my Sabbaths they greatly profaned. Then I said, I will pour out my wrath upon them in the wilderness, to make a full end of them. But I acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations, in whose sight I had brought them out. Moreover, I swore to them in the wilderness that I would not bring them into the land that I had given them, a land flowing with milk and honey, the most glorious of all lands, because they rejected my rules and did not walk in my statutes, and profaned my Sabbaths, for their heart went after idols. Nevertheless, my eye spared them, and I did not destroy them or make a full end of them in the wilderness. And I said to their children in the wilderness, do not walk in the statutes of your fathers, nor keep their rules, nor defile yourselves with their idols. I am the Lord your God. Walk in my statutes. Be careful to obey my rules, and keep my Sabbaths holy, that they may be a sign between me and you, and that you may know I am the Lord your God. But the children rebelled against me. They did not walk in my statutes, and were not careful to obey my rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live. They profaned my Sabbaths. And then I said, I will pour out my wrath upon them, and spend my anger against them in the wilderness. But I withheld my hand, and acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations in whose sight I had brought them out. Moreover, I swore to them in the wilderness that I would scatter them among the nations, and disperse them through the countries, because they had not obeyed my rules, but had rejected my statutes and profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were set on their fathers' idols. What is rejection of the Sabbath? It's not messing up exactly what hoops you jump through on the seventh day. It's not messing up this or that detail, although the details are important. Rejection of the Sabbath is when you don't enter into God's rest that He has provided for you to begin with, because that's where man's life starts, is in God's rest. And the sacrifices and everything else were symbolic of God's work on your behalf. And the keeping of God's law flows out of that relationship with God. And we've confound it, we turn it upside down, we get it backwards. Our rest must be in God, because the work is God's. And the good works that we shall do flow from God's work on our behalf and His power in us. So that the 6-day, 1-day rest pattern is God's pattern for God. And mankind sees the reverse of that. We begin with the one day and move into the 6 days of work. When we get out of that primary thing that it must begin with the rest of God, we foul the whole thing up. And that is where idolatry enters, and with that enters in the rejection of all of God's law. So this is the primary significance of the Sabbath for man. Now, when we come back, we're going to see a couple instances briefly of how Jesus fulfills this, about how this same theme is outlined in the New Testament, and how that compares to other worldviews in relation to work and rest and the creation. So for now, this is The Devoted Word, and I'm Joel McDermott. We're brought to you by the American Vision. Please remember to like and share, and consider becoming a monthly supporter of this ministry at AmericanVision.org. And as always, we thank you for your time and your support.